Hello and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 228, The Princes and the Emperor. If there was one group that had consistently thwarted Maximilian's grand plans for world domination, it was the princes of the Holy Roman Empire. He had given in to their demands for Imperial Reform, he had granted the Reichstag far-reaching powers, he had established the Reichskammergericht as a law court independent of imperial authority, and he had announced the much-longed-for ban on feuding. But did the princes, counts, knights and cities hold up their end of the bargain and paid him taxes to raise the armies needed to defend the borders of the empire? Well, you bet. They left him hanging before Livorno, they collected berries instead of fighting in the Swiss war, and they will not raise a little finger to help Ludovico il Moro to regain his duchy of Milan, even though Milan had been an imperial fief since the days of Charlemagne and Otto the Great. No money, no soldiers, no nothing. When Maximilian called a Reichstag in Augsburg in 1500 to raise support for his ally, the Duke of Milan, the princes stalled the opening until news arrived that Ludovico had been captured and marched off to a French prison where he would end his days. Small sidebar here. Ludovico il Moro had been Maximilian's most important source of finance. He had paid him a sum total of 1,000,000 florins over the years, many multiples of the empire's contributions. And when Ludovico finally demanded payback from Maximilian, the emperor had to raise his hands and admit that all the cash had gone and that he had no soldiers or vassals he could call on to help. In his decisive battle against the French, Ludovico was deserted by his Swiss and German mercenaries, mainly because he could no longer pay them. There was no money, no more. But let's get back to Maximilian's problem with the imperial princes. As we have seen these last dozens or so episodes, the two emperors, Friedrich III and Maximilian, had a whole host of problems. There were the external enemies, the Turks, the Hungarians, and most prominently the French. Soon Venice will join this not very exclusive club. Another issue were family frictions, Friedrich III with his brother and cousins, and now Maximilian with his son Philip the Handsome. And there was the limited capacity of their homelands to sustain their pan-European political ambitions. And these capacity limitations were in part inherited from predecessors, that's namely Sigismund of Tyrol and Charles the Bold in Burgundy. But that was exacerbated by the nonchalant way in which they managed their resources, pushing again and again for taxes and subsidies, but rarely investing these in infrastructure or even the effective defense of their own borders. But there, and in particular Maximilian's Achilles heel, was the lack of support from the empire. We have done the numbers before, but let's just reiterate. The empire, including Bohemia, the Swiss Confederacy, Savoy, Provence, northern Italy and the Low Countries, held 23 million people in 1500, compared to France's 13 million, Spain and England at single-digit millions, and even the massive Jagiellonian Empire of Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, Bohemia and Hungary came to no more than 12 million. Moreover, the empire comprised all the wealthiest and most industrialized, in inverted commas, parts of the continent. In other words, if united, the empire was a colossus that could force all its neighbors into submission. We know, and the players of the Renaissance game of painted thrones knew, that the empire was not united. But nobody yet knew how disunited it was. They did not know for a fact that the Swiss would go their entirely own way, and that northern Italy would become a pawn in the contest between Spain and France. When the French king, the Doge of Venice, the Pope, the King of Naples, the Duke of Milan, the kings of Spain and England made their political calculations, they had to assume that there was a not insignificant probability that tens of thousands of battle-hardened Teutones could come across the Alps at any moment. And that is why they sent observers to the various Reichstags, and that is why they offered the German princes brass and brides. And that concern or hope, depending on viewpoint, is what had kept Maximilian in the great game of European politics. Ludovico il Moro kept shelling out cash and marrying his niece to Maximilian because he believed the threat of an imperial intervention would keep Louis XII away. The Holy League invited Maximilian because they thought he could bring a mighty force to sway the battle at Fornovo. And when Maximilian presented his grand plan to wipe the upstart French king off the map, well, they all listened. But in all and every one of these cases, Maximilian came up short, incredibly short. Every single time, the Reichstag refused the money to hire the armies, or, if the taxes were already agreed, failed to collect them. They did not even honor his demand to join him on his coronation journey to Rome. So, Maximilian only ever brought along tiny armies, essentially all that his exhausted lands could afford. Which leads to the very simple question: why? We know why the imperial princes refused to support Friedrich III, except for that one time at the Siege of Neuss. The princes did not fight for that stubborn old man because the old man was so stubborn and had consistently refused to grant imperial reforms that in any way reduced the imperial prerogatives, to the extent that those still existed. But why did they refuse to help Maximilian, who had given in to most of their demands at the Diet of Worms in 1495, as discussed in episode 223 and 225, and Duncan Hardy had so eloquently explained? The common view, shared by Maximilian's most thorough biographer, Hermann Wiesecker, is also the simplest. These princes did not care one bit about the empire, not its institutions, its reputation, not even its territorial integrity. All they cared about was their own advancement, the transformation of their bundles of rights into territorial states, and most of all they cared about their independence from the emperor, which is why they did not want him to be successful and hence powerful. They were unfazed by neither the French nor the Ottoman threat, since the borders to these powers were manned by the House of Habsburg, and as long as the Habsburgs had some money, or at least credit, they should have the honor and the expense of being the shield of Christendom. And reading some of Maximilian's speeches, this is very much the view of the emperor and his entourage. Heinz Angermayer, the preeminent historian of the Imperial Reform process, believes that there was a structural fault in the Imperial Reforms of 1495 that prevented the princes from wholeheartedly buying into the project. The 1495 reforms had provided institutions dealing with rule-making, the Reichstag, and adjudicating, the Reichskammergericht. So in modern parlance, that would be the legislative and the judiciary power. But it had not created viable institutions for the exercise of executive power. Hence the years following 1495 were taken up with defining the structure, rights, and composition of this executive power. Only once that had settled could the princes accept a reduction in their sovereignty in exchange for an increase in justice and stability. And then there's also a third option, which is that the princes believed that Maximilian's plans were bonkers. That's English for nuts, or for us Germans, durchgeknallt. The grand plan of surrounding and burying the French king under the ruins of the Louvre was simply one set of many steps too far. They wanted their emperor to first sort out the still raging feuding in the empire before he should set off on some wild adventures in foreign lands. Let's keep these three perspectives in mind as we look into the Imperial Diet of Augsburg in the summer of the year 1500. And yes, we have now officially crossed the line into the 16th century. This gathering had originally been scheduled for the beginning of the year, leaving enough time to raise an army that could support Ludovico and Moro in his attempt to take back the duchy of Milan. But the delegates dithered and delayed until April, when news arrived that Ludovico and Moro had already been betrayed at Novara and had been apprehended by the French authorities. And just allow me one little tidbit about the events that led to the Duke's arrest, which says a lot about the Swiss mercenary and justice system. Here's the situation. The French had defeated Ludovico in a battle outside the walls of the city of Novara in northern Italy. Ludovico lost that battle mainly because his Swiss mercenaries refused to fight other Swiss mercenaries in the pay of the French king. And then there was the minor issue of not getting paid. After the battle, Ludovico and his remaining soldiers, including his Swiss mercenaries, gathered inside Novara, where they then soon capitulated. The Swiss mercenaries were granted the right to leave honorably with their weapons and were now filing out of the town. But Ludovico, on the other hand, was asked to surrender and hand himself over, something he had no intention of doing. Instead, he tried to flee, disguised as one of the Swiss mercenaries. The French suspected this, and hence the French officers controlled each of the men leaving Novara. Ludovico's mercenaries who'd been offered a bag of silver and probably felt a bit ashamed about what happened, were willing to smuggle him out. And that scheme worked reasonably well. Though obviously a lot of the soldiers knew who Ludovico was, the Swiss officers made sure that they all stayed stum. And once the vast majority of the soldiers, including Ludovico, had passed through the gates, the French began to panic. The great prize may have escaped them. They walked back and forth, checking all the men who were around for a second and a third time. At that point, Hans or Robert Tomani from the canton of Uri approached the French officer, asking him what he would pay him to point out the Duke. Apparently, the price for a deposed prince in 1500 was 200 florins. The French paid when Turman pointed out Ludovico. Ludovico was captured and ended his days in jail. Now comes the interesting part. What do you think happened to the traitor Tomani? If he had been an ordinary Landsknecht, well, he would have simply disappeared. Nobody knew him. Nobody knew where he was from. Nobody could ever find him. But the Swiss were different. Everybody knew everybody. Hence everybody knew who had betrayed the Duke, and they knew who he was and where he lived. And they told everyone at home in Uri what he had done. Hence when Tomani dared to come back 3 years later, believing that everybody had forgotten about the affair, he was in for a shock. He was dragged before a court, accused of dishonoring the regiment and betraying the Swiss Confederacy, who had wanted to keep the Duke for themselves. Witness statements were taken and a jury condemned him to death, and they had him executed. It was events like these that earned the Swiss mercenaries the reputation for being disciplined and reliable. But now let's go back to the Imperial Diet in Augsburg. When Maximilian was finally able to open proceedings, he must have been raging with anger. Once again, the imperial princes had left him in the lurch, and this time in the most humiliating fashion. He might not have liked his wife Bianca Maria Sforza much, but seeing her uncle frog-marched into a French prison was an affront of epic proportions. He began his speech, talking about the main threats to the empire, from the Turks and now from the French, who were not at the border, but inside the borders of the Holy Roman Empire. And let us not forget the Venetians, who had taken large swathes of what had once been the March of Verona and the Patriarchy of Aquileia, with not as much as a by your leave. Things, he said, were about to become much worse. The King of France was soon going to travel to Rome and be crowned emperor, taking away the grandest of imperial princely titles, that of Prince Elector. And then the French, together with the Venetians, will attack the Austrian lands, come across the Alps, and take their principalities one by one. What was needed was to complete the reform process and establish a standing army, such as the French, the English, the Spanish, the Hungarians, and probably dozens of others already had. Such an army would need a permanent source of funding, not such an ad hoc grant of money that never arrived. The response from the princes? Obviously, Maximilian's mind had once again left off on one of his pipe dreams. Only because you, Maximilian, want to see the King of France burning to ash in his palace, does not mean Louis want the same for you or us princes. The King of France, the princes said, was a sensible man, a man one could do business with. They will send him an embassy to negotiate a deal, and all will be fine. So you see, there's a big gap in the political positioning here. We have no detailed accounts of the proceedings, but it's likely that discussions went back to one of the proposals of the Diet of Worms that were not implemented. Berthold of Henneberg, the Archbishop of Mainz and Arch-Chancellor, had pushed hard for what he called the Reichsregiment, a government made up of princes and city representatives who would manage the affairs of the empire on the day-to-day. Maximilian had rejected this in Worms in 1495 as going too far in reducing his powers. But now Maximilian seemed to have been more amenable to the idea. What brought on that change of mind cannot be ascertained. Wiesecker argues that Maximilian had been pushed into a corner by the princes along the lines of sign here or all your power will be lost. Angermeyer takes a different stance. According to him, Maximilian saw value in the idea of having a permanent institution that would handle administrative matters and deal with emergencies. He had seen that the Imperial Reform had been incomplete without some form of executive branch. Maximilian's preferred option wasn't the Reichsregiment, the centralized organization, but a set of imperial circles that bundled smaller and larger principalities together under an imperial captain. In his proposal there should be 4 of these, excluding the Habsburg lands. But the idea of the circles was rejected by the princes, which meant the discussion circled back to the Reichsregiment. And that is where they came out in the end. The Reichsregiment, the central government, was to be made up of 20 members, which included the prince-electors, and then a rotating set of representatives of the princes and the cities, and then 2 imperial knights. The emperor was given the chairmanship of the Reichsregiment when he was present in person. Otherwise, it fell to the most senior prince, which was usually the Archbishop of Mainz, aka our friend Berthold of Henneberg. This new government took on the responsibilities of the Reichstag when it was not sitting, which included the right to issue imperial bans. They had oversight of the Reichskammergericht and responsibility to maintain the ewige Landfrieden, aka the ban on feuding, and they had oversight of the collection and distribution of the imperial taxes. They took up residence in Nuremberg. What did Maximilian get in exchange? Well, what he was promised was a permanent army of the empire under his command. That sounds like very little for giving up pretty much all of his rights as a monarch. However, we have to remember that in the mind of most medieval rulers, and in many ways Maximilian was a medieval ruler, warfare was the main task of the monarch. He did not think much or cared much about building infrastructure, policing, or welfare policies, so he was happy to hand these tasks over to the princes who he understood he needed. If he received a standing army in exchange for this, that would be a fair deal. Not a brilliant deal, but a fair one. So though he sounded a bit clipped when he delivered the concluding statements of the Reichstag, I do not think he thought this was an apocalyptic fail that will cost him all that was left of the power that an Otto the Great or a Barbarossa had once wielded. The reckoning came when the Reichsregiment held its first session and decided that the command of the imperial army should go to one of the imperial princes, not to Maximilian, and of course his army was never established, nor were the common taxes ever collected. In the discussions in Augsburg, Maximilian had said that if the princes refused his call for support once more, he would not wait for his enemies to steal the imperial crown, he would rather smash it on the floor and pick up the pieces. What he meant by that was that he would let the empire go down the drains, take whatever imperial lands were left for himself, and let the smaller and mid-sized estates fall prey to the bigger ones in one gigantic civil war. None of that crown smashing happened in real life, but the civil war, that did indeed happen. So Maximilian decided to completely ignore the Reichsregiment and the other institutions created in 1495. He promoted his Reichshofrat as an effective source of justice and focused on his own lands for once. He did implement some major administrative and military reforms in Austria, Tyrol, and further Austria that laid the foundations for the Austro-Hungarian imperial administration of the centuries that followed. He built out the Zeughaus, the great armory of Innsbruck, where he housed his artillery, one of the most sophisticated and innovative in Europe. It is also where he established an armorer's workshop that attracted masters from Nuremberg and Augsburg, an establishment that rivaled the city-based manufacturers in scale and quality. And he did bide his time and focused on other matters. In the meantime, the Reichsregiment proved almost immediately to be extraordinarily ineffective. A committee of 20 is unwieldy in the best of times, but one that includes representations from various estates, most of them rotating in short intervals and then being superseded by the Reichstag when it was sitting, well, that was a recipe for instant paralysis. Tax discipline did not improve, so the Reichskammergericht ran out of money and was temporarily shut. And anyway, its judgments could not be enforced since the famous standing army was never established. And it did not help that Berthold of Henneberg, the motor behind the whole endeavour, died in 1504. And then there was the minor issue of a massive civil war. It is a war we've already heard about, the War of the Landshut Succession from episode 197. I just knew that one time it would come in handy, because now I do not have to go into much detail here. So the bottom line here was that the Duke, Georg the Rich of Bavaria Landshut, he of the famous Landshut wedding, left behind just one daughter. And according to the Wittelsbach family compact, that should mean that his duchy would go to his cousin, Albrecht of Bavaria Munich. And with that, all the Duke's men would have done the impossible and put Bavaria back together again. But Georg no longer liked his cousin Albrecht, and in his will gave all his lands and titles to his daughter and his son-in-law. And that son-in-law was from the other branch of the Wittelsbach family, the Counts Palatine on the Rhine. You will be surprised to hear that this disagreement was not resolved by the Reichskammergericht, as should have been the case under the Ewige Landfrieden. Instead, it was resolved by the force of arms. And since Albrecht was Maximilian's brother-in-law, he and all the Habsburg allies lined up on his side, whilst Habsburg's strongest opponents lined up on the other. The whole affair was extremely brutal, as both sides used the famously undisciplined Landsknechte whose skill in raping and pillaging was unsurpassed at the time. And even in this merciless conflict, Maximilian's brutality stood out. When the garrison of Kufstein surrendered after a long siege, he had all the defenders executed as traitors. And then he had this despicable event immortalized in an engraving by Hans Burgmeier. And this time, Maximilian did win. At the next imperial diet in 1505 in Cologne, he formally abolished the Reichsregiment that had so obviously failed to prevent this violence. And he showed himself again as a magnanimous ruler when he created a new statelet from bits of Georg's inheritance for the defeated party, the Counts Palatine. Pfalz-Neuburg, as this statelet was called, became the childhood home of Georg's grandson, Otto Heinrich of the Palatinate, one of Germany's most impressive Renaissance princes, architect of the centerpiece of the Heidelberger Schloss, and owner of some of the grandest pieces of armor ever produced. The combination of the utter failure of the princely Reichsregiment, the victory in the War of the Landshut Succession, and his magnanimous verdict gave Maximilian the leeway to once more adjust the imperial constitution. He introduced the imperial circles in 1512, the ones that actually worked, and tasked them with enforcing the judgments of the reconstituted Reichskammergericht. And he abandoned the common penny for the Reichsmatrikel, the system whereby every estate committed to provide a set number of riders and infantry, or the equivalent in cash. That took out all that uncertainty about how much in taxes could be raised and, most importantly, from who. And tax collection was now in the hands of the estates, meaning there weren't imperial tax collectors roaming around the empire and undermining the integrity of the territorial principalities. That was an arrangement the princes could live with. Sure, they did not want to be brought under the cosh of their imperial overlord. At the same time, they realized that they could not operate in an open dog-eat-dog world. Rules needed to be, and the Reichsregiment of 1500 and its second iteration in 1521 proved that a weak imperial oversight was much better than a closer control by the princes themselves, which actually in practice meant only the prince-electors. So over time, the empire then settled into this model of a mixed monarchy, where royal prerogatives were shared between the emperor and the estates that made the Holy Roman Empire so unique. And in this system, Maximilian and his successors were able to raise forces, not the overwhelming force the empire could in theory mobilize, but better than nothing. So for once in a long time, a success for Maximilian. But there are more to come as we go through the next few episodes. The early modern world and its two main protagonists, the Kingdom of France and the Habsburg, not the Holy Roman Empire, are taking shape. If my planning holds, we should soon see the full picture of what Maximilian's grandson, Charles V, will inherit. And once we see that, this season will come to its close. And the next one, the great one, the one about the Reformation, will kick off. I hope you'll stick around for that, and I'm pretty sure it will be worth it. And before you all go, let me just thank all you generous patrons who keep this show on the road and advertising free. I keep getting asked to join podcast networks that would take on much of the dour marketing activity and promise a massive increase in listenership. But these offers come with a sting, i.e. I would have to allow advertising on the show. After all, these guys do not run charities. But I want to stick to what I promised, no advertising, which makes this endeavor entirely dependent on the generosity of such lovely people like Thomas R., Thomas B.C., David P., Matt N., Tom D., who is also a huge supporter across all social media platforms, and John W., who sadly passed away recently. And if you want to join this elite group, go to historyofthegermans.com/support, where lots and lots of options await you.